Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Tina Kampt. I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. It is, as ever, my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this evening's event. Thank you all for turning out. We're excited to welcome back some of our most cherished members of our community and to welcome another member of our community, a new member of our community. My job here is really, really simple, which is to extend the warmest invitation to participate in as active a way as you possibly can in this event. So without further delay, I am going to actually hand over to my colleague, Monica Miller, who is an associate professor in English and Africana Studies, who will be moderating this event. Please welcome Monica Miller.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Tina. This kind of event, the recognition and celebration of an unsung figure, is often full of belated thanks. Tonight, as we honor Pauli Murray and discuss her extraordinary life and legacy, we will be, I think, both belated and right on time. Is it in this spirit that I offer these short introductory, I'm going to try to be short, introductory remarks that aim to straddle these kind of temporal poles and bring us into this lovely present community. As many of you know, Pauli Murray, until recently, was an under-recognized figure in the civil rights and feminist movements. As we will hear from our distinguished guest tonight, Murray was a poet, a writer, an activist, a labor organizer, a legal theorist, and an Episcopal priest. She took on key social and economic justice issues of her day: racial segregation, equal protection under the law, the rights of women and the working class. Her work as a legal scholar was used to desegregate public schools in the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case. She was a founder, along with Betty Friedan, of the National Organization for Women, and a longtime friend and advisor to Eleanor Roosevelt. The subject of really exciting and groundbreaking recent scholarship and activism in her name, Murray is now being recognized and celebrated for her legal and activist work in the service of freedom and equality, even as we learn of another struggle she waged but could not name in her lifetime, that against homophobia and gender dysphoria. If she lived now, she might have identified as transgender. I will admit myself to not knowing much about Murray until I had a series of conversations starting about 15 years ago, mostly with Rosalind Rosenberg, as she quietly and unofficially mentored me when I was a new faculty member here at Barnard. In these conversations, Rosalind told me about an extraordinary woman, Pauli Murray, whose biography she was working on, having just finished another necessary book, Changing the Subject: How the Women of Columbia Shaped the Way We Think About Sex and Politics. While Murray was never a Barnard or Columbia student or professor, she came close, as she had hoped to attend Columbia. Not allowed to apply because of her gender, she later rejected Barnard, partly because it rebuffed her. She was suspicious of single-sex education as potentially separate but not equal, and could also not afford Barnard's entrance fees. The year was 1926, the same year that Zora Neale Hurston became Barnard's first Black student. Imagine the damage those two could have done together. In any case, my conversations with Rosalind about Murray and Hurston were of a piece with rigorous and engaged conversations about Black feminism, racial, sexual, and gendered politics that I was also having with my students at the time. I remember one student in particular, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, another Pauline. In addition to informally mentoring many faculty and students, Rosalind also had a formal mentoring duty in her role as faculty coordinator for the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, a national fellowship program designed to support and encourage students of color and those committed to diversity in earning a PhD. I am a Mellon Fellow, having entered the program in 1989. Alexis was my mentee in the Barnard Mellon program in the early 2000s, and Rosalind supported us both. This spring, a decade and a half later, Rosalind's biography of Pauli Murray, Jane Crow, appeared at the same time that Alexis's book, Spill: Scenes of Black Feminist Fugitivity, was garnering the praise it deserves when it was nominated for a 2017 Lambda Literary Award. In the years between their time on campus and the present, Rosalind had retired from teaching, but continued her scholarly detective journey through Murray's life. Alexis has gone to graduate school and made Durham, North Carolina, Murray's hometown, her own home with her partner, artist and activist Sangodare, Julia Roxanne Wallace. Durham is the epicenter of their incredible scholarship, activism, and loving partnership. It is the locale from which their globalized vision of art and activism attempts to heal the world. So in closing, I would like to belatedly thank Rosalind for showing me by example that rigor and kindness absolutely go together in academia. And I would like to thank Alexis for thinking creatively way outside of the box as a student and now a colleague. I'm so grateful for your time travel, even if you don't remember it, and your honoring, along with Julia, our ancestors. I'm grateful for the fact that you are all here tonight. Short introductions. Our first speaker tonight will be Rosalind Rosenberg, a specialist in American history with a focus on women's legal and social history. Rosalind was a distinguished and beloved member of the Barnard faculty for over 20 years. She is the author of 3 books, Beyond Separate Spheres, Intellectual Roots of Modern Feminism, Changing the Subject, How the Women of Columbia Shaped the Way We Think About Sex and Politics, and Jane Crow, The Life of Pauli Murray. Queer Black troublemaker Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Barnard class of 2004, is an independent scholar and activist, author of recent books Spill, Scenes of Black Feminist Fugitivity, and co-editor of Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines. Alexis's latest book, Archive, will be published by Duke University Press next spring. A meditation on and with Jackie Alexander, it will be refusing the lines between art, science, spirit, scholarship, and politics. Sangodare, Julia Roxanne Wallace, is a filmmaker, composer, theology scholar, writer, and director of the film When We Free, and founder of Queer Renaissance, a multimedia movement. With Alexis, she's co-founder of Mobile Homecoming, a national intergenerational experiential archive project that amplifies generations of Black LGBTQ brilliance in community making. Sangodare is artist in residence at the Department of Art and the University of Minnesota from 2017 to 2019. There, she will be working on her own projects and collaborating with Alexis, who will be the Winton Chair in the Liberal Arts during the same time. One more thanks. This thanks goes in particular to our generous co-sponsors, many of whom offered to help with this event even before they were asked. I'd like to thank the Athena Center for Leadership Studies, the Barnard Departments of Africana Studies, History, Women's Sexuality and Gender Studies, the Barnard Consortium for Critical Interdisciplinary Studies, the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, and the Barnard Center for Research on Women. In particular, I'd like to thank Avi Cummings, Tammy Navarro, Tina Campt, and Catherine McLean for all of their help with all of the details. Finally, I'd let you know how the evening is going to go. Rosalind is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Alexis and Julia are going to come up, and then we'll have a moderated question and answer before we get to your questions. We promise we'll have that time. Okay, Rosalind.
Thank you, Monica and Tina, very much. I hope you'll all read Jane Crow, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of context orchestrated around 3 themes: the boy-girl, the bet, and the priest. Pauli Murray was born in 1910 of mixed-race parents in Baltimore, Maryland, but was orphaned at 3. Her maternal grandparents and aunts took her in, and she grew up in Durham, North Carolina, in the home that her grandfather built in the 1890s. She was adopted by one of her 2 aunts, and her namesake, Aunt Pauline. And it was Aunt Pauline who was sort of the sturdy center of her life growing up. Murray felt in between from a very early age. She felt in between in her life racially. She felt in between in her gender. And this in-betweenness both troubled her and formed the foundation for the enormously creative work that she did throughout her life. She felt in between racially because the home where she grew up was one in which the other members were much lighter than she was. Her Aunt Pauline and grandmother could have passed for white. And they loved Pauli, and Grandma Cornelia in particular was very warm. But Grandma Cornelia, the whitest of the family was very concerned that Pauli would be discriminated against because of her color, and did everything that she could to protect Pauli. But, you know, if only I could shake Grandma Cornelia. She would say, cold cream your face, child. Don't let it get too dark. Comb your hair, child. Don't let it get too kinky. Don't suck on your lips, child. They'll look niggerish. This, not surprisingly, troubled Pauli Murray a lot. This distress was compounded by the fact that the children at school were all much darker than she was. And when things fell apart, as routinely they did in elementary school, the other children would taunt her for being so light. They would call her a white bastard, a Jew baby, because of her relatively light skin. So this was a child who, from her earliest years, was acutely sensitive to the issue of color and the unfairness that it could bring, privately, in the family, and in the broader world. At the same time, she was very, felt very in between in her gender. This is harder to track because the earliest document that we have of her struggle over her gender was in an oral history she did in 1968, and in the kind of offhand way, she commented that when she was 8 years old, Aunt Pauline took her back to Baltimore for a family gathering, and took advantage of being in a big city by taking her to a department store to get her a winter outfit. So Aunt Pauline leads Pauli to the girls' department. Pauli says, I don't want to, and leads Aunt Pauline to the boys' department and insists on getting a boy's coat and hat. And Aunt Pauline, a teacher of young children, believed firmly that children, no matter how young, should be able to make their own decisions, and if Pauli wanted to go around dressed as a boy, that was Pauli's decision, even if it elicited laughter, and it did, back home in Durham. And further supporting Pauli, when Pauli said that she really felt that inside she was a boy, Aunt Pauline said that was fine. She would call her boy girl. And so Pauli always knew that at home she was safe as a boy girl. So those two senses that she had were tremendously important to her. The family also supported her in emphasizing the supreme importance of education, and of belonging to the Episcopal Church. The church was an important part of Pauli's life from childhood on. So with his support, Pauli Murray grows up to be a person who is an activist, a lawyer, a poet, a priest, and who continues to challenge well-settled conventions, often behind the scenes, very much ahead of her time, but with transformative effect. Pauli might have stayed in Durham but for the tightening grip of Jim Crow, but she couldn't stand the segregated buses, the segregated theaters, the segregated schools, and worst of all, the lynchings, which shattered the community again and again. She grew up at the nadir of race relations in the United States at the time when Jim Crow was at its worst. And so with Aunt Pauline's help, she escaped to New York City when she was 15, having just graduated from high school. Thought after she learned that Columbia didn't admit women that she would go to Barnard, but it turns out because of her education, she couldn't go to Barnard because she hadn't met the requirements for Barnard, part of Jim Crow education in the South. She also couldn't afford, as Monica says, the tuition. I think the combination of Murray and Hurston, thank you, is instructive. They both wanted to go to Barnard at the same time. Pauli Murray was 15 years old, educated in Jim Crow school district, and poor. Hurston wasn't rich, but she was 34 years old. She was an established author who had caught the attention of Annie Nathan Meyer, who paid for her to come here. So just that's what it took in order to be the first black student at Barnard. Age, tremendous accomplishment, and someone who was able and willing to pay the way. So Pauli stayed in New York. She took a final year of high school in Queens, graduated, and went to Hunter College. which was quite a bracing experience for her, much more demanding than anything that she had ever known. But she did well. She majored in English. She graduated into the Great Depression and would not have survived but for Eleanor Roosevelt, whom she met in those years. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who set up the female analog of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And Pauli went to Camp Tara in upstate New York, where she fell in love with a white counselor, Peggy Holmes. But the relationship foundered because Peggy could not accept Pauli as the man that Pauli believed she was. The term transgender did not exist in the 1930s. There was no LGBTQ movement to support Murray, but there was a rich literature of sexology, and Pauli Murray read it all. She particularly came to value the work of the British sexologist Havelock Ellis. Ellis argued that everyone is male, everyone is female, in differing degrees, and that there was an unusual example of this in people he called pseudo-hermaphrodites. These were people who appeared to be one gender on the outside, but had internal organs of another gender on the inside. Bingo. Pauli didn't have transgender, she didn't have a social movement, but she had an idea. She thought that she was a pseudo-hermaphrodite and set about trying to persuade doctors of this. She discovered testosterone, asked many, many doctors to give her testosterone. They were willing to give her estrogen, but they would not give her testosterone. She sought exploratory surgery in the hope that the surgeon could find undescended testes. The surgeon didn't find any. No one would help. In the midst of this struggle, Murray decided that in order to get a job, she needed to have more education. Aunt Pauline was on her case to come home to Durham, and so she decided she would apply to the University of North Carolina. Now, it's true she knew that the University of North Carolina had never accepted any black students. On the other hand, she wanted to go to graduate school. There were no graduate schools for African Americans in North Carolina. Besides, her great-grandfather had been a trustee at UNC. Her great-aunt had given her estate to UNC for scholarships for students. I mean, they would accept her, right? No, they didn't. They turned her down because of her race. Indignant but undaunted, Murray went on to challenge race discrimination in public transportation and to campaign against laws that barred blacks from the voting booth. But she failed, as did all other civil rights workers in those years at both of these efforts. And so she decided she was going to have to become a lawyer and change the laws. So in 1941, at the age of 40, she entered Howard Law School with the help of a family friend by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Howard Law School was historically black, no problem about race, but she was tormented by her classmates because she appeared to be female. And she was stunned by this. She couldn't believe that Howard Law School, which was the foremost school in the country for the training of civil rights attorneys in those years, wouldn't see the parallel between discrimination on the basis of race and discrimination on the basis of gender. She buckled down, she made her way to the head of the class, and she graduated valedictorian. Now, it was customary in those years for the valedictorian at Howard Law School to go to Harvard for a finishing degree before coming back to Howard to become a faculty member. So she applied and was rejected because of her gender. Harvard Law School did not take women at that time. At the very time that another physician was rejecting her request for testosterone, Murray wrote this letter of appeal to Harvard Law School faculty. Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds on this subject. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other? The answer was yes. Harvard said no. Murray never lost this inner sense of maleness, but faced with rejection and ridicule, she turned this private gender identity dysphoria into one of the most important ideas of the 20th century. that the category of gender, like that of race, is inherently arbitrary because it has no clear boundaries. Thinking like a lawyer, Murray reasoned that because the state used these arbitrary categories to discriminate against people, they violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. No state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Beginning in 1944, while still at law school, Murray embarked on that campaign, on a campaign to advance this idea with a bet. To the laughter of her classmates, she bet a professor that Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the 1896 Supreme Court decision that held that institutions could be separate so long as they were equal, she bet that that case would be overturned in 25 years. The bet was $10. Murray won the bet in only 10 years in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 by persuading her friend Thurgood Marshall that he ought to give up on this campaign he was involved in trying to make schools equal financially and just attack segregation as per se unequal under the 14th Amendment. Murray went on to serve on the Commission on the Status of Women in 1961 under President John F. Kennedy, appointed by her friend Eleanor Roosevelt, and persuaded the committee that the 14th Amendment was the way to pursue equality for women. She persuaded Betty Friedan to found with her and others an NAACP for women. Friedan came up with the name NOW. And then in 1971, Murray inspired Ruth Bader Ginsburg to argue in a case, Reed v. Reed, that an Idaho law that favored men over women as executors of estates was arbitrary. For the first time, the court ruled that women are entitled to the equal protection of the law, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg would put Pauli Murray's name on the brief with her. Through much of this time, Murray relied on the support of white women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I will remind you, was the first tenured woman at Columbia Law School. A little shout out for Columbia Law School. Through much of this time, Murray relied on the support of a white woman, Renee Barlow, who accepted Murray's gender identity and shared her Episcopal faith. They called each other partner and supported each other until Barlow's death in 1973. Grief-stricken, Murray gave up a tenured position at Brandeis University to enter the General Theological Seminary, and in 1977 became the first black female Episcopal priest. In her final years, Murray often described her life as a spiritual quest that had led to a Christ in whom there is no black or white, there is no male or female, there is no north or south. Murray died of pancreatic cancer in 1985 at the age of 74. She left much still to be done before her vision of inclusiveness could be achieved, but over the course of her life, Murray had laid a legal and theological foundation on which others could build. Thank you.
Pauli Murray. I'm so happy to be here tonight. So happy to see so many familiar faces. So happy to see so many people excited about Pauli Murray. My initiation into the Order of Pauli Murray began when I got an invitation to be a part of a sermon slam. And at this sermon slam, you could do poetry or you could do a sermon. And I did a five-minute sermon entitled Male and Female in the Beginning, or What If God is Whole? And I've been preaching ever since. So for me, every time we gather in the name of, in honor of Pauli Murray, it's a ceremony. When we gather for Saint Pauli Murray, it is a ceremony. It is an invitation for us to grow, for us to transform. Are y'all willing to participate in this ceremony with us? Yeah. Are y'all willing to participate in this ceremony with us? Okay, well, in that case, I would like to share my vows. For me, Saint Pauli Murray is a patron saint, almost Shango, a trailblazer and the blaze. Reflection, reflected in many of the faces I see out here today. For me, Pauli Murray, Saint Pauli Murray is a transformer, innovator, a song in a weary throat and a rock in a weary land. For Saint Pauli Murray, I am a disciple. I am almost Shango. I am obedient. I am healing and self-care. For Saint Pauli Murray, I am a poet, a preacher, and perhaps a dream deferred, realized.
Yes, yes. No, that's right. And for me, Pauli Murray is a Pauline predecessor named for her Aunt Pauline. I'm here with my mother Pauline, who I'm named for right now. So we feel that we're in good company. We have been named to create new worlds. This collage is a collage I made in honor of Pauli Murray called Heritage, with a lot of different people's hair, this collage. And the word, I don't know if you all can all see, the word on her shoulder is Pauline, and that's actually a cutout from my graduation invitations that I never sent to anybody. Like, they give you your name for graduation announcements, but I guess I never announced my high school graduation. So Pauli Murray is holding Pauline on her shoulder and is tangled. So for me, Pauli Murray is someone who has brought people together in Durham, North Carolina, who would not otherwise have sat in the same room. So she has brought me as a Black feminist, accountable to Pauli Murray's legacy as a Black feminist, into the room with Episcopal clergy that I never would have been in the room with otherwise, with lawyers who I never would have sought out on my own otherwise, with Pauli Murray's own descendants and family members who I've had the blessing of being in an intergenerational conversation about gender, sexuality, acceptance, and love with over the past 9 years. And Pauli Murray is not finished with the work that she's doing. She is doing a specific form of work in Durham, North Carolina. Her book, Proud Shoes, where she documents her family history and she documents the building of Durham, and she talks about the role that slavery played in the building of Durham, but also the intersecting sexual violence that created our community of Durham. She's having Durham relearn how to tell our own history. And so, as a member of the steering committee of the Pauli Murray Project, which has sourced this project in Durham, North Carolina at Pauli Murray's childhood home called the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, we're transforming what it means to tell our history. And it has not been simple in Durham, North Carolina to tell the whole story of who Pauli Murray is and who Pauli Murray has been. And so it's been ongoing to understand that to be the first person on record to advocate for what we would now call hormone replacement therapy as a revolutionary act, as revolutionary as the fact that she's the first Black woman Episcopal priest, as revolutionary as the fact that she wrote and was not fully given credit for the argument that won Brown versus Board of Education, has been difficult even with Pauli Murray's own relatives and descendants. So Pauli Murray has blessed us in Durham with the opportunity to move beyond pathologizing difference to really understanding calling. Like, how are we called to change the communities that we're in? And so I want to give gratitude as a troublemaker in the tradition of Pauli Murray before I knew who Pauli Murray was, to two of the people who supported me as a troublemaker in this community, not to recount the against the rules things that I did when I was a student here at Barnard, but just to say that Rosalind Rosenberg, I don't know if you remember this, but you said something to me on the 1 train. And there were about 5 other Mellon Fellows with us on the train. And you were talking about how the best scholars are those people who are pushed to the outside and have to find a way to talk about what we understand as normative society from this place on the outside. Like, have to learn to be insightful, have to learn to be creative. And as a queer Black troublemaker, Black feminist love evangelist, very strange person from a young age, that is something I've carried with me. And so the fact that I have believed that I could go beyond boundaries has been because there was something like, oh, but this is what makes great scholars, right? This is what creates a great legal mind, theological mind, like Pauli Murray. That constant exclusion that we've faced actually has a divinity and a purpose. So thank you for saying that to me so many years ago, because I've said it to the people I mentor. I've said it to the young women in the Indigo After School program who planted the flowers outside of Pauli Murray's childhood home and who go there and read excerpts of her book. And Pauli Murray wrote a book of poems called Dark Testament, and the title poem, Dark Testament, has this line that we use in Black feminist breathing, which is a practice of basically trying to clear our bodies of the nonsense that we've been taught in this society by repeatedly chanting brilliant things said by revolutionary Black feminist ancestors, including Pauli Murray. And so the quote that we use is, "Give me a song of hope and love and a brown girl's heart to hear it." So for Pauli Murray, I am that brown girl with an open heart. I am committed that Durham, North Carolina will never forget the name Pauli Murray, and I'm so excited that we have murals facilitated by Brett Cook all over our city celebrating Pauli Murray in her gender diversity. I'm so proud that we have children who, when we move around the city, say, "Thank you, Pauli," every time we pass those murals, like understanding that gratitude is necessary. We even have a hip-hop album based on Jenna Ray McNeil's interviews with Pauli Murray, where a young, straight, cis, Black male Christian preacher remixes himself into dialogue with Pauli Murray and then creates an entire album of music that's affirming to young people, young Black gender nonconforming people who have attempted suicide in our community. So Pauli Murray's work was definitely not done, but it is being done, and we're accountable to that. So we wanted to share with you today a poem that we were commissioned to create for the dedication, the designation ceremony and celebration of the Pauli Murray family home as a National Historic Landmark, the 39th in North Carolina, and the first in the nation focused on women and LGBTQ history. Y'all ready? Yep. All right. Brave brain and a bright brown heart, with a Baltimore start and a Durham education. Brown mud for the stolen blood, for the leaking foundation of the segregated dead. Brown girl dreams from generations of Paulines turned tomboy steam, office boy gleam in grandpa's shining shoes. Crushed, clenched heart for the oversmart, for a season's start to repair. Boyish art, an impish chart of shorter and shorter hair. Loud love for the vital shove, for the swinging glove, for the fight. Open teeth for the news this week, and 1,000 letters that bite. Love for the torch that was lit on this porch by grandma's lip and grandpa's cane. Hope for the dirt turned under the hurt that witnessed the theft and the pain. Love for the dirt, called on to hold the bones of the daily slain. It is this brown dirt that we activate and water with your name. And if this brown land cannot understand the blood on our hands, the indigenous, Black, and European strands that ran and ran out in your veins, then we turn it over again. If this brown land has underplanned for the love of Black women to dismantle Jim Crow and Jane, then we turn the land over again. If this brown land seeks to reprimand the lesbian or the gay, then we turn the land over again. Then we turn it over today. If this brown land cannot clearly stand for the young and the broke and the queer and the trans, then your life would have been in vain. So we must turn it over again. And with these brown hands on our open hearts, we remember your refrain. Give me a song, a world, give me hope. Give me a song, a people, give me faith. Give me a song, a country, give me kindliness. Give me a song, a brown heart, give me love. Do you hear me? Sing it, believe in it, live it, give it.
Give me a song.
Give it.
Give me a song.
Give it.
A prophecy purchased with the labor endured by our beloved, a future fulfilled, any moment matured by those who cease to put fear above it. A song to welcome in a weary throat, a song for a weary land. Give it now, give it to understand. Or, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing? We're not the right one on our side, the saint of God's own choosing. And though this world with sorrows filled does threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for St. Pauli hath willed her triumph, her truth to triumph through us. We will not fear, for St. Pauli hath willed their truth to triumph through us. I can hear St. Pauli say, come here, Pauli. The map I left of lock and key for doors you may now open to honor me, my legacy. You are now blessed and certainly beholden. Then, y'all, by and by, when the morning of our opening comes, all of we saints will join together as one. We'll tell the story of how we overcome. We'll understand it better outside of time. How we made up our minds by never leaving anyone behind. How we made up our minds by never leaving anyone behind. How we made up our minds by never leaving anyone behind.
Thank you so much for all of that. I have a few questions. I'm just going to ask the questions. Because one of the things that I was really interested in thinking about when I was bringing Rosalind and Alexis and Julia together was the really different ways that you come at Pauli Murray, right? And in particular, I know that both of you, or all of you, right, are obsessed with archives, right? As historians. So I wanted to ask a question about Rosalind. I remember when we had these initial conversations about Pauli Murray, you were towards the beginning of the archival work. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how your story of Murray changed, right, as you went through her archive and shaped the narrative of your book. And Alexis and Julia, I'm really interested in how you use Pauli Murray as archive, right, and the way in which Pauli Murray's archive for you is something that is local, right, and in some ways it is a local archive, but it's also incredibly proximate and intimate, right? You were telling me right before that you lived around the corner from Pauli Murray's ancestral home for a long time and could hear the birds in her yard right, from your house. So I'm interested in kind of how all of you have been working with Pauli Murray as archive.
Pauli Murray left her papers to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe College at Harvard University. And when they became open in the mid-1990s, I wanted to see them right away. I, of course, knew her published work, especially Proud Shoes and Song on a Weary Throat. When I got there and realized that there were 135 boxes of personal papers, letters, she kept carbon copies of the letters she wrote, as well as the letters that were sent to her, her journals, scrapbooks, wonderful pictures. What a treasure trove. I knew it would take a long time to get through them. The box 4, in my first trip, I got through box 4, and folder 71 was marked medical sexuality, and everything in that folder spoke to the issue of her struggles with gender, her search for testosterone. But what changed in the years as I kept going back and going through more of the boxes was the realization of the degree to which her thinking about gender in a way that wasn't really allowed or even articulated when she was young informed all other parts of her life. Mm-hmm. And so at first I thought the story was, oh, this is someone who had a big impact on the world, and you would not know from reading her published work that she'd ever had these struggles at all. But by the end, I'd come to the conclusion that the struggles themselves were what allowed her to think so creatively and influentially, ultimately, about legal theory and ultimately theology as well.
Yes. So in Durham, Pauli Murray as someone who, I mean, this is just, I feel like Pauli Murray is a genius from beyond the grave, because I feel like there are things that the living would never think of. She's like still thinking beyond those boundaries as she haunts Durham in particular ways. So Pauli Murray lived a life and kept an archival record. Mm-hmm. That means that people can't try to claim part of Pauli Murray's legacy without being confronted with the entirety of her legacy, because people have tried. So in Durham, it has been incredible to see how, because Pauli Murray exists and Pauli Murray has been placed in this way at the center of how do we tell the history of Durham. Like I said before, people have come together who never otherwise would have come together. But also, when people try to exclude aspects of the conversation, exclude gender and sexuality, for example, from the conversation, and it's not coincidental that that's what's excluded most often from this particular conversation, it actually has been the work, I mean, and Rosalind, in your earlier work, you know, really talking about Pauli Murray and gender in your history of women at Barnard and Columbia, that has been one of the first things that we've been able to cite in order to be able to say, okay, listen, this is on record. So even though Pauli Murray's letters aren't here, you know, we know these pictures, like the dude picture exists, right? Yeah. And so we have had to be accountable to that archive, which has had us be accountable to the archive of who exists and is silenced in our own communities in a different way. Has also really pushed us to be accountable to the archives of our own body and experience in a different way. And I wonder if you would want to talk about the experience of the think tank, because Sangodare is part of a think tank that's part of developing this Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. And there's a powerful sermon where Pauli Murray is, again, you know, offering institutional critique to every institution that she ever was part of. And she says, we're not going to heal until we face the truth. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Okay.
You could say no, too. I just.
I'll circle back to that from the initial question. And so Pauli Murray's sermons, as like my point of engagement with the archive, are really exciting, but because it's like I'm reading them and I see where she's going right up to the edge of what she feels like she can say in her time. And it's like, if you are paying attention, or if you know something about her life, you can see that edge. And it's like there's a baton, and she's just, and talking about gender and talking about sexuality. Revolutionary as she was, and those letters were like fire, like they were burning people and cutting people and really pushing people to grow and to, put down some of the isms and the oppressive practices that they were holding on to. But in those sermons, it's as if, and related to gender and sexuality, it's as if she couldn't bring the full force of that flame. And even in my theology textbooks, she's in there doing that work. And so, like Alexis is talking about, in terms of archive, you have to face that. In relationship to the think tank, I think once again it's a space where it can be hard. It can be hard to. I can say it like this. For me, we're creating a center for Pauli Murray that's about her legacy and her work. Pauli Murray should be centered in that. The young Pauli Murray all the way up to Pauli Murray at 74 should be centered in that. And so I really feel like that my work and my role is to make sure that that's there. Whereas sometimes it can be really easy to say, yes, we need to include, people that identify as transgender, the people that identify as LGBTQ. And, my point is, no, we need to include the other people. We need to center those identities that are Pauli Murray. And I think that we all have that charge and that challenge, and hopefully that'll be one of the outcomes of this ceremony that you have agreed to participate in.
And that we know is being recorded and will be shared over the internet.
Yeah. So that actually leads really well into my next question. I mean, one of the things that I was really grateful for in Rosalind's book was in some way the attention to Murray's early life and her participation, right, and kind of enduring friendships, for example, with some of the kind of main figures of not only the civil rights movement, but before that with the Harlem Renaissance, right? And this is a little bit out of date, but there's an incredible passage in Rosalind's book where when I think Murray and James Baldwin were at, was it the McDowell?
They were the first African Americans to be admitted to the McDowell colony up in New Hampshire, the famous artist retreat, and they had cabins right next door to each other.
Right, and I think it's Murray remembers that James Baldwin was thought of by the artists at McDowell as silent, sweet, and popular, while Murray was considered to be blustering and a little rude, right? So. But then she also describes the kind of relationship between the two of them. He wrote "Stranger in the Village" while there, and she was working on, was it Proud Shoes?
Proud Shoes.
Yeah, she was working on Proud Shoes. So there's this incredible kind of moment where these two kind of iconic figures, LGBTQ figures, are kind of working together and proximate. So one of the things when I'm teaching the Harlem Renaissance, my students often ask me, why is it important, right, that we need to know the sexuality, right, of the people that we're reading? Or why is it important that we think through the kind of the whole person? So I just wanted to have you talk a little bit about why that's important.
To a certain extent, the Baldwin image as sweet and the Murray image as blustery is, of course, totally sexist. But I think that there may have been something in their family backgrounds that may also help explain it, because Pauli Murray was encouraged by her family to speak out And she was always outspoken. What troubled her in her relationship with Baldwin at MacDowell was that the other artists found Baldwin's work deeply disturbing, and they found her work nice. That really upset her. She wanted to be disturbing too. And I think Proud Shoes is a much better book because I've read every draft of it. And the book in 1954 was nice. The published work in 1956 is disturbing. It talks about rape. It talks about conflicts with her grandmother over color. There's a lot that's disturbing in that book, and I think her relationship with Baldwin helps explain it.
I would say another reason why, well, what Audre Lorde said, she was interviewed and asked about why did she introduce herself the way that she introduced herself? Like Black, feminist, lesbian, poet, warrior, mother, like why would she make that list every time that she was where she was? And there's a radio interview where she was asked about that, and she said, I never knew about Langston Hughes' sexuality. And so I was there in the Harlem Writers Guild with him, thinking I'm the only person who's deviant, and I didn't have to think that. So she made a commitment. Every room she was in, she was going to say the list, so people didn't have to wonder and feel like they were alone. And I think about that in terms of Pauli Murray, because Pauli Murray was doing this research about sexology, partially because she was institutionalized in asylums. Like after multiple breakups, she would be reevaluating her life, but she was literally institutionalized for her deviance and was having to try to find a way to make herself make sense. And so because Pauli Murray then left a record of who she was and everything that she did, it's not acceptable for somebody to have to be institutionalized, for somebody to be invalidated to the extent that there's no precedent for any part of who you are in the way that she was. Pauli Murray is somebody who was institutionalized in for anybody to be institutionalized in an asylum in the 1930s is horrific. But as we know, Pauli Murray's father was killed by a guard in an asylum when he was institutionalized. So that this is, when I think about how Pauli Murray does haunt us, and when I think about why bringing that fire into the conversation, like not necessarily being nice about it, like, oh, they don't want to talk about that aspect of Pauli Murray, and some of these people we're in conversations with, they're like 90 years old, so we'll just is because it's not acceptable for young people who are being institutionalized in a number of ways, not who live like 5 steps from where Pauli Murray grew up, to not understand that there's a person who existed, who has made a major contribution to our history, who is like a saint of the Episcopal Church, who shared something in common with you that's being silenced over and over and over again. So that's why when I think about that question is, why is it necessary to say that, which is a question that has been asked in relationship to Pauli Murray. Like, why talk about, don't get into her bedroom, why talk about her relationships, why talk about these things that, were a struggle for her? There's Patricia Bell Scott was speaking at Howard University a couple of weeks ago, and we were really honored to be there. It was a celebration of Pauli Murray, and it was a reclaiming of some of what Pauli Murray experienced that Rosalind talked about at Howard. And Patricia Bell Scott talked about letters where Pauli Murray said, "My lost causes are being found." And so that's what we're talking about when we say, okay, so she got to see Brown versus Board of Education. She got to achieve the priesthood. She got to achieve certain things in her life, but she had lost causes that are still being found. They don't need to be lost again,
Well, I think about all that she accomplished. It's as if she lived, 3 or 4 lifetimes. Yeah. But think what she could have accomplished if not met at every turn with dehumanization, with rejection of her identifying, articulating who she is and what she was capable of doing. Just think of what she could have accomplished. Think of all of the ways that we benefit, our parents, our children, our grandchildren, some of us, how we benefit, and how we could benefit more had she not met all those boundaries. Okay. Now, what could we do? You know what I'm saying? Why is it important? What could we do if by knowing about Pauli Murray, people are able to get right, we're able to accomplish more. All of us have the potential to accomplish those amazing things that Pauli Murray did if we had the love and the support and the, you know what I'm saying? So to me, that's just simply why it's important, because we're all here to accomplish so much. If folks will just leave us alone and let us be who we are, we can do that.
One of the things that Pauli Murray put a lot of faith in, right, was, and what was interesting to me reading Rosalind's book as a literary critic, was she put in a tremendous amount of faith in legal language, right, and legal rhetoric. And I was just struck by the way in which, even when she was arguing, right, to become an Episcopal priest, she put it in the form, right, of a kind of brief, right? I mean, in terms of why this was a necessary thing for her to do. So one of the things I'm interested in is also thinking about, you know, why does she have this faith in legal language, right? I mean, how did she understand that social justice, right, in her time, right, was going to necessitate, right, some kind of like really minute, right, and in some ways, you know, very specific relationship, right, to the language of the law.
This is where historical context helps. Pauli Murray fought throughout the 1930s in the civil rights movement and the labor movement without seeing that much accomplished. She was pretty discouraged by the end of the decade, and she went to law school because she thought that the law might offer a way of sort of breaking through all of the barriers. And she did it at a time when the Supreme Court was changing. It may come as a great surprise, especially to younger members of the audience, that in the 1930s, the Supreme Court was a deeply conservative institution, striking down every one of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal successes in Congress. But by the end of the decade, as older conservative justices began retiring and dying, Roosevelt took advantage of their leave-taking by appointing the most liberal justices he could possibly find. He was upfront and outspoken about what he was doing. So by the time Murray graduated from law school, the Supreme Court had become a much more liberal place. And that gave her the hope that it would be possible to actually change some of these laws that were holding so many people back. In fact, the court was liberal until the late 1960s. It may be liberal one day again. Probably not in my lifetime, but one can hope. Well, I also have to say that it was once said that people go to law school to learn to make sounds like a lawyer. And Pauli learned to make sounds like a lawyer, and she couldn't help it. The rest of her life, those were the sounds she made, whatever she was doing.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing that I also didn't think of until we were at Howard Law School, was also that Pauli Murray's great-grandfather and great-uncle, right, these people who were part of founding University of North Carolina, they were lawyers. And they were using the law to literally take rights away from black people, right? Yes. So her white ancestors had actually done an incredible amount of damage through the law that continued to haunt her, even when she tried to go to the school that they founded, right?
Yeah.
So to me, this intergenerational imperative, you know, even just to try to undo what her own ancestors had done would be reason enough for her to be engaged with the law, but it's also firsthand experience of the intergenerationality of the law, right? Of Pauli Murray, I agree, not being content to live one lifetime at one time, was interested in having an impact beyond her lifetime, and felt that the law was a strategic way that she could do that, but also had seen, in the negative sense, how that had been the case. So that historical context is important too.
Okay. I think we should open it up for your questions and comments.
Yes, that's a tough one.
Oh, sure. Repeat the question. Yeah.
Mark Carnes from the Barnard History Department has observed that we've all been referring to Pauli Murray with female pronouns. And how do we square this with other things that we've said? I'll speak for myself. One draft I wrote using male pronouns, especially, and I did it for the chapters of the 1930s and 40s and early 50s when she was searching most desperately for medical help. After that, she shifts and becomes more gender fluid. And so I wrote those chapters using various gender neutral pronouns. And I thought, well, that's kind of a clever way of handling it. But the trouble is that in doing that, in the end, I felt as though I was importing sort of my own current concerns to her life and undermining the difficulties she was facing in her life. I mean, she never identified publicly as transgender. I had difficulty for many years getting permission from the family to allow to quote from the papers because many members of the family did not believe that she ever struggled in this way. And so I went back to using female pronouns, but always using her language as much as possible to show that she was in struggle with this and felt in some sense that she wasn't really female, that she was male, or at least she was male and female.
Yeah, I'll say I gave a nod to this issue in the poem by using they, but in thinking about Pauli Murray, and particularly in the way that I've engaged her sermons, the way that I see it is that she transcends gender, and in her lifetime, I understand her to have used female pronouns, and so I use those pronouns, but understanding that all of the pronouns are inadequate, and it's the limitation of our language and why poetry, I think, is a much more useful way to engage when thinking about it.
Yeah, and I really embrace that dissonance. I have no doubt that Pauli Murray wants dissonance in my life. And the failure, definitely the failure of pronouns is something that it really does signal the work that we have to do. And I'm just present to the dissonance.
Yeah, I'm Julia's grandfather. So, so this whole fluid conversation needs to continue, but it's developing as we go along. And so understanding, so when you were speaking, I definitely was understanding more about the young 30-somethings refusing to use he or she and using they. We used to use they back in the day, and how we used it was if someone was at work, and I worked for the Board of Ed, so I would hear, I didn't actually do it, but I would hear people saying, we're talking about the night before, they were talking about their partner, a lesbian would be talking about her partner. She would say, oh, they said that they're not going to the dance tonight. And we all knew what that meant. So the same pronoun now is used a little differently, but it certainly is appropriate here.
I just want to say this is really wonderful, and Pauli would be so happy. I really, let me just say, I went to her home and interviewed her I think it was 1982 in Baltimore. And she was dressed in, her blue jeans and the way we dress. And we had a really blunt conversation. And she told me to go to Radcliffe and look at her papers. And because I asked her what were the parameters of what she wanted me to write about. And she said, be free, go look at my papers. And so I was a little shocked when you said her papers weren't open until the 1990s, because I went up in 1980.
The early papers that she gave were the family papers, the early family papers, and books, papers related to the books that she wrote. But the rest the rest of the papers were opened over a later period in the 1990s.
Well, I guess she gave me permission, because I saw box 4. That's what she wanted me to look at. But she was fantastic. She really was. And, Audre Lorde Presente in a great, powerful poet tradition. One question, her descendants are being difficult about what you present?
There were reservations for many years, but
And these are her nieces?
but they did give their permission in the end.
Oh, good. Well, and does Durham have other archives? Or
No. There's not another set of archives in Durham. There's just the ongoing practice.
this is what you're doing?
Some questions, lots of questions.
Oh, Claire just reminded me that I should say something about how blunt Pauli Murray was with Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she brought her lover for dinner. So there are several times when, she's just very open with Eleanor Roosevelt.
I just want to really thank the panel and all of you who have done this very difficult work that I feel is so very important. I think about the community that I've known my lifetime and the lives that could have been touched and sometimes saved by the work that is so buried. And I am, at this particular time in my life, I think it is so important that the voices of those who speak to injustice and discrimination and oppression has to be heard more and more, because those that are fighting to keep the evil that continues to plague our society alive are strong. So the work that you're doing is so very important, and it not only has to be heard within our communities, but it needs to be in our education system, because we cannot change the minds of our community, of our world, until we get it into our education system, where most of our thoughts, our ideas, our creativity, our minds are born. And we learn so much in that education system, but yet we don't have work like this that really can change the heart, the mind, and the spirit of those that make it so important to the society. Oppression and injustice has to be fought against. And I think the work that she is doing speaks in so many volumes to that. And I thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
Hi, she said thank you a lot better than I ever could have, but as our moderator said, it's belated, but also right on time. My question had to do with archives as well. Towards the epilogue of your book, had the opportunity of reading Jane Crow. You talked a little bit about having Pauli Murray's papers actually sanitized immediately after her death, by her relatives, specifically her sister, and even though we still have a wealth of information, clearly, do you see gaps? Do you dream of things that you wish you still had? Do we actually know what was destroyed or quote unquote sanitized? And how does that affect your research?
Well, it's very sad as you're reading through a handwritten diary and you find pages that have been cut out. And you just don't know. I'm grateful for what was left behind. And it takes patience. It's reading in a group of letters that may not seem relevant, but all of a sudden you see an exchange that helps. So if you leave 135 boxes of papers, there are going to be some things that get through. That's true.
I'm interested in how Pauli Murray came to know some of the most pivotal figures in the 20th century, people who later went on to become pivotal figures like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but also Eleanor Roosevelt, Thurgood Marshall, and Professor Rosenberg, you spoke in your interview, James Baldwin, you spoke in your interview on the Barnard website about how Pauli Murray was broke for her entire life and often had a hard time making a living. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how she supported herself.
You know, I was critical of Grandma Cornelia for the things that she said to Pauli that must have made her feel anxious about her color. But Grandma Cornelia did something else that was that I think helped Pauli, and that is she said, "You came from fine people. You came from educators. You came from lawyers. There's good blood in you," which gave Mary a certain confidence, and she had this extraordinary nerve to reach out to people. They were no more important than she was. You know, her great-great-grandfather had been a trustee at the University of North Carolina. Her grandfather, rapist though he was a lawyer. And so and there were members of her family who had been economically very successful. So that there was never anything about Pauli Murray of, poor little me, who's going to listen to me. She thought she was something. And her grandfather, who was an abolitionist from Pennsylvania, who had gone to what is now Lincoln University, who had fought in the Civil War, been wounded there, gone south after the war to open schools for freedmen and women, taught her in her earliest years. And when she didn't speak correctly, he said, "You're going to speak like this," and he made her speak the King's English, which helped a lot later on because she may have been dirt poor, but she was trained to be middle class and to be confident, and to understand that history was long. I think if there's a takeaway from Pauli Murray's life, there are two. One is, as bad as things are right now, there were times in the past when things were achieved, and the goal should be to reclaim them and to make, yes, the Civil Rights Amendments were largely ignored and undercut, but you know what those amendments were, and you make sure that they work for people in the future. So she had an historical memory that went back to the 1840s, and an appreciation of the significance of Black history that was really unusual for someone of her time. She was poor because she graduated into the Great Depression, and she was Black and she was female. She was also poor because she insisted that she do work that had meaning. This is not the road to financial success. I would say those two things. The second takeaway from this, and I was very touched that Alexis mentioned this earlier, Pauli Murray is a wonderful example of the work of the German philosopher George Simmel, who argued that the most important thinkers in history are he said the marginal men. I would broaden that. And Pauli Murray was a marginal person who took advantage of that marginality to have a different angle of vision on the world in which she lived and to contribute enormously as a result. Race, there was financial security, there was the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Marty Ginsburg were conforming to traditional heteronormative lives. All of that. And Ruth was one of the first women to go to Harvard Law School. Pauli made it possible. The vote, by the way, on her case was 7 to 7, 7 for, 7 against. So they decided not to admit her. But that made Ruth able to go. Ruth had an education that Pauli would have died for. Not to take anything away from Marty, he was a fabulous, fabulous support. But it were all of these other things too, and that's really what I was trying to get at the book, how multi-layered privilege can be.
I'm here with part of my class, the graduate seminar on women's and gender history from the MA program at Sarah Lawrence College. We read your book as our first book of the semester, and we really enjoyed it. So happy. One of the things so I want to say two things. My PhD, I direct the Women's History program now, but my PhD is in African history. So the first thing I want to say is actually the chapter that you did about Ghana, I said to the class, is one of the best that I have read in terms of the struggles that she faced, the fact that she wasn't recognized for a lot of the work that she did in Ghana. And so I just want to compliment you on that. I really thought it was excellent. I've read a lot of that material. And then, I'm going to ask a question that I think you all have answered, but it came up in the class as well. So the first question was about archives, and you all talked about the use of archives. But one of the things that we discussed in the class was, how do you write a biography of someone who has written an autobiography? So what do you add to the story of someone who has already written the story of their life?
Well, it certainly gave me pause. Pauli Murray is a great writer, and she wrote a wonderful memoir. But she left a lot out. And I would say two of the most important things that she left out were the story of her inner struggles about gender and sexuality. And the other was her youthful radicalism. And she left both out because she was writing her memoir in the 1970s and early 80s. She was poor, but she wasn't an idiot. She wanted to get work. And she had been denied work many times because of her youthful radicalism. And she feared that she would be denied more work if there were any question about her gender and sexuality. So all of that was left out. And the papers were so rich in that regard that I thought, well, there are lots of books about Franklin Roosevelt, right? Not as many books about Eleanor, but we have the foremost authority on Eleanor Roosevelt and her biographer here. So there were other works on Eleanor Roosevelt, but Blanche's is the best.
I also want to give a shout out to another biographer in the building whose birthday happened to have been yesterday. Alexis DeVoe, Audre Lorde's biographer, is also here with us. I love you.
Rosalind and Alexis and Julia are going to stay here. There's a small reception over here in the corner. So if you join me in thanking them, we can continue the conversation.